Please be opening your Bibles to Romans chapter 3, and we're going to be looking at verses 21 to 31 tonight as we continue looking at this book on Sunday nights. I have to say, one of the reasons why I was nervous to start preaching through the book of Romans is because of some passages that we've looked at the beginning of Romans 3, and then this section. I feel like I've been trying to be a sponge that is soaked in a ton of water, and the only thing I'm able to do is wring out a couple drops. This is, in my judgment, one of the richest passages in Scripture, and there's no way that we can, do full justice to it. But all of us in our lives, we've had moments where we know that we're in over our head. Maybe you've had financial woes and you knew that you needed somebody to help you. Maybe you had some kind of medical diagnosis and you knew that you needed somebody to oversee treatments and help you. Maybe you've had relationship problems where you needed to go to somebody for some kind of help because just you and that person that were struggling together wasn't going to be able to work through things. If that's true for earthly circumstances, how much more would that be true about us before our Creator? That before God, we don't have a leg to stand on. Before God, we've fallen short of His glory. We'll say more about what that means in just a moment. We're in the middle of an argument that Paul's been making, where beginning in Romans 1:18 through 3:20, what his whole point in this section is summed up in Romans 3:9, where he says both Jews and Greeks are under sin. That obviously the Gentiles who worship at the pagan temples, obviously they're not right with God, but the Jews who had the true temple and they had the law of Moses that God had actually given the people, that they weren't right before God either. And so we use this quote from Timothy Keller, part of this quote, to explain what's going on in this section of Romans where Keller says, we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. That's one way that you can summarize this section in the book of Romans. We are far worse before God than we ever want to admit. And we get so busy trying to accumulate a resume for ourselves to make ourselves think that we're actually better than we are. Romans chapter 3, verse 21, which is the pivot in this book, in fact, the first couple of words in our text for tonight is, but now. If the book of Romans just continued on giving the kind of argument that it gave starting in 1:18, and if it just did that through the rest of the book, there would be no hope for us. But this section begins by saying, but now. And the second part of Timothy Keller's quote, yet at the very same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. That's one way that you could summarize Romans 3:21 through 5:21. If we resist the truth about ourselves as sinners before God, we will never appreciate what it is that Jesus has done for us. In this section that we're looking at tonight, one person has said that these verses are possibly the most important single paragraph ever written. If we don't grasp the truths of this passage, and what Paul will do in this section is he'll explain the truths, and then in chapter 4 and 5, he's going to illustrate the truths more. So tonight is going to be a little bit more conceptual, and then, Lord willing, in the coming weeks, it's going to be expanding on everything that we're talking about tonight. So let's go ahead and read Romans chapter 3, verses 21 to 31. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of God's glory, and are justified by His grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by His blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness because in His divine forbearance He had passed over former sins. It was to show His righteousness at the present time, so that He might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means, on the contrary, we uphold the law. Now, before we actually get into the heart of this lesson, I want to explain something that we started talking about in the last lesson, and that's what the word justified means. Let me show you this quote from Michael Gorman. He says, "We should be struck by the word family that permeates the passage. The words right, anything that has like righteousness or righteous or justice or justification in this passage, in the Greek comes from dikaiosune, that family word, and its linguistic siblings. This group of words appears 7 times in 21 through 26, and the same word family appears 2 more times in verses 27 to 31. What this means is whenever you see the word righteousness or justice or justification, it's all part of this same family of words. They're kind of cousin terms. And what these words mean in this passage is something like to set something right. Or it's oftentimes used in a courtroom setting, where if somebody is wondering if they're going to be declared innocent or guilty, if the gavel is pounded and they are justified, that means that the judge has said that I don't hold your sins against you. In this passage, we need to be justified. We need the gavel pounded, and we need to be set right from our own sin. But it's not just us that need justification. As we go through this passage, we'll see that God also, in a sense, needs to be justified. And we'll explain why that's the case as we go through this. But let me just remind you something that this text is reminding us of. Look at verse 23 again. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. What is the glory of God? I think the glory of God would be referring to the character of God. Jesus is the glory of God. He's the one that fleshed God out and was the perfect image bearer of God. And we've all fallen short of his marvelous character, which is another way of saying all the things that we've seen before. So we're sinners before God, we've fallen short of his glory, and so how is it that we can actually be justified? And we're going to talk about this under 3 headings. Number 1, what is the channel of justification? Number 2, what are the grounds of justification? And number 3, what are the results of justification? So let's think through these things together. Let's think first of all about the channel of justification. What's the means by which we're justified, or what's the pathway by which God can pound the gavel and say about ungodly people, you're now declared innocent? Well, this text is saying something that we've seen before as we've been looking at this, that we are not justified through the channel of the law. In verse 21, the text begins and ends with this kind of idea. In verse 21, we see that the righteousness of God, the way that God makes man righteous, has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. Or another way that you could look at verse 21 is the way that God proves that he's in the right has been manifested apart from the law and the prophets. It was never going to be the law and the prophets that was going to make man righteous. Romans 3:20 says, through law comes the knowledge of sin. We don't read the Old Covenant law and go, you know what? I feel like I'm a pretty good person. If you're reading it right, you're going to get down to your knees and ask God for mercy. So it's not through that, but what Paul says in verse 21 is that the law and the prophets bear witness to justification by faith. Where would you see that in the Old Testament, God was saying that the way that man has been saved and will be saved is by faith, and it's not by the law that's being laid down? Could you find passages in the Old Testament where the law and the prophets are bearing witness to the fact that we're not going to be justified by the law? One passage that comes to my mind is Jeremiah 31, verse 31, and then the end of verse 34. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, for I will forgive their iniquity and I will remember their sin no more. God's going to make a new covenant. He's going to take the old covenant that has shown people their sin, and he's going to replace it with a new covenant, showing that even in the law and the prophets, they were foretelling that there was going to be a different path by which people were going to be saved. It wasn't going to be through the law. And by the way, look at verse 31. In all of this, when Paul says, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means, on the contrary, we uphold the law. Somebody might suggest, well, Paul, that means that you're against the law. And he says, no, no, no. Everything that I'm saying in this passage is upholding the law. The law itself is saying that there's going to be some other way by which man was going to be justified. And in Romans chapter 4, he's going to bring up the example of Abraham, who himself was justified by faith, and that's written about in the law. The law is upholding this idea that people were always justified by faith, and that is actually the channel of justification, is faith. And you see it in this passage in a couple different ways, that Jesus is to be received by faith in verse 25. That in verse 26, the one who has faith in Jesus is going to be the one that's justified. In verse 30, the circumcised are going to be justified by faith, and the uncircumcised through faith. You can see the word faith brought up so many times in this passage that this is the channel by which people are justified. Now, sometimes people will look at a passage like this and say, well, the Bible's teaching that we're justified by faith alone. Think about that for a moment. If you understand faith as the Bible is portraying, then there might be a degree of truth to that statement, depending on what you mean. But unfortunately, in our religious society, when people use the term faith alone, what they think that means is mental assent. Just that if you just, in your mind, believe what Jesus has done for you, then in that moment you are saved. There's a lot of even evangelical Protestant authors that are punching against that really hard. And I've been reading some of these guys and what they're saying about this. Let me show you a quote from one of them, Michael Gorman. I quoted him earlier, but I'll quote him again here. It says, for Paul, faith is clearly a comprehensive response. Trust, absolute surrender, obedience, and commitment. It includes faithfulness. The gospel offers grace and demands obedient faith. The channel by which God can pound the gavel and look at somebody and say, you are innocent, is if somebody has faith. What is faith? Loyalty. Faith is unwavering commitment. The book of Romans begins and ends by using the phrase, the obedience of faith, in Romans 1:5 and 16:26. Now, ask yourself for a moment, if you look at this quote, does your life reflect this kind of faith? This is what the word means. If I was to tell you that there's going to be a tornado that was going to come to your house tonight and destroy your house and completely level it, and you really believed me, you would not stay in your house tonight. If Jesus says something in the Bible, you're not going to shake your head and go, you know what, I just kind of mentally assent, and I don't really think that I'm going to be saved by my works or my obedience or something. I think if I mentally accept what he says, then that's good enough. And that's not in any way the picture that the Bible gives of what faith is. Let me push this a little further. Could you be somebody who takes the Lord's Supper every Sunday and sings a cappella? Could you do those things, and that by itself does not mean that you're justified? Can you do those activities without actually living by faith? The character quality of a real Christian is somebody who has faith. That's the channel by which they're justified. Now, if you're living by faith, yeah, you'll take the Lord's Supper. You'll worship the way that the Bible teaches, things like that. But the core question is, do you have unswerving loyalty for King Jesus? Those are the people that are marked out as the ones that are justified. Now, at this point, we might be thinking about everything that we're talking about right now. and wonder if this channel of justification is qualitatively different than being justified by works. Do you know what I mean by that? Somebody might say, we're not justified by being perfect because nobody's going to be perfect, but we're justified by faith, and faith is unswerving loyalty. Well, does that kind of sounds like I got to be perfect. This is going to be expanded more in Romans chapter 4. But let me say a couple things about this for now. In Romans chapter 4, do you know who's going to be held up as the examples of faith? Abraham and David. Were they perfect? You think about Abraham and how he was scared about people taking his wife from him. So on 2 occasions, he lies about Sarah not actually being his wife to save his own skin. And then in between those times, he's worried that God's not going to fulfill his promise to give him a son. So he sleeps with Hagar and has a child through her. And you see him making mistakes. But the trajectory of his life is one of faith. And God counts that as worthy of pounding the gavel and saying innocent. Maybe one way that we could illustrate this is a man and a woman get married. We're using the words faith, faithfulness. What does faithfulness oftentimes mean in marriage? Let's say that just hypothetically, I get upset with Samantha about something because it would never actually happen. And so, I do the silent treatment on her for like 8 hours or something. And it's like a little mishap in our relationship. Does that mishap mean I've been unfaithful or she's been unfaithful to me? No, we're still committed to each other, but there's been, there's a little tension right now. Now, if somebody cheats on somebody, that's forsaking the covenant. Think about being faithful to Jesus. You start putting things above him. You walk away from him. You forsake him, and you say you're done with him. That's one thing. But walking in the steps of Abraham, like Romans 4 is going to say, is in no way implying that this justification by faith demands that everybody's going to be absolutely perfect, because he's already saying that the law shows us we can't do that. Let me say it this way. Being justified by faith, what God has done for us is he's given us an attainable standard by which we can be saved. It's an attainable standard. You can be faithful to Jesus. Your trajectory in life can be towards Jesus. And the fact that he died for us shows that he knows we're not going to do it perfectly. But you can know if you've turned your back on him or not. You can know if you're aiming to follow him. Those are the people that are justified. Do you see that? We'll say more about that in the coming lessons, as when we get to Romans 4, when we get to Romans 6, and Romans 12 through 16, we'll say more things about that. But your devotion, your loyalty to him, ask yourself the question, is this really describing your life? Or do we come here, get check marks, and during the week, God is not really what we're seeking? Don't deceive yourself thinking that you're living by faith then. We have to ask this next question, though. What's the grounds of justification? What's the justification for God justifying people? And one of the ways that you could ask this is, how can God allow sinners to be justified? After he just spent 118 through 320 showing that people are sinners before God and nobody's righteous, can you imagine a judge in court saying, you are guilty, you've done vile things, but I'll forgive you? We would look at a justice system that keeps doing that. Never mind, I'm not going to get into that. So there was something that happened today, and apparently the guy's already out on bail. We'd look at that kind of thing, and we would say, what's wrong with our justice system? You know who needs to be justified is not just us, but God in this passage. The righteousness of God. God showing that it's righteous for him to be declaring people righteous. Notice a couple of things that this says. In verse 25, this was to show God's righteousness, God's righteous character. God is in the right for doing what he's doing, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. In the Old Testament, God wasn't barbecuing people every single time they sinned. Well, it looks like he's letting people get off scot-free. How can a righteous God who demands holiness let this go on? Or, look at verse 26, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. That Jesus is just, God is just, he's in the right, he's innocent for making other people innocent. Do you see the conundrum here? By what means can God declare people innocent and he's not just waving his magic hand over sin? This is where we get into atonement theory, and we do not have time to discuss all of the nuances of this. I have to say that out of all the sermons I've ever preached, this part of this sermon is the most intellectually difficult part of a sermon I've ever put together in my life. But I'm going to try to distill this as simply as I can. By what grounds can Jesus justify people, and he's in the right for doing it? Think about three things that this passage shows. Number one is the faithfulness of Jesus. If you have the ESV translation, it says this: the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Do you see that that's kind of repeating itself? The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus for what? For all who believe. So, is Paul just repeating himself here, where he, through faith for all who believe? Or in the Greek, there's another way that you can read this passage. And there's some other translations that render it this way, like, for example, the Net translation says, through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ for all who believe. Or the King James says, by faith of Jesus Christ unto all and upon all them that believe. Rather than the passage at the beginning emphasizing our personal faith in Jesus, because it brings it up at the end of the text, it could be that the beginning of the text is talking about one of the grounds that God can do this is that Jesus was faithful. The faithfulness of Jesus has made it so that anybody who believes in him can be justified. And I think that's a better way of reading this, by the way. What would this mean, though? Jesus was faithful to everything the Father told him. He was faithful to going to the cross. He was faithful in his trials and temptations. Every time he was tempted to sin, he always said no. Even when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he was praying if there was some other option, but your will be done. And he's faithful to everything the Father said. What if Jesus wasn't faithful? He would have sinned and he couldn't have been our Savior. One of the grounds of our justification is that Jesus came and he did what no human being ever could have done before. Think about David and Goliath. Remember in the story of David and Goliath, and Goliath is taunting the Israelites for 40 days, and here comes little David bringing bread and cheese to his brothers. And then he sees this big giant taunting the people, and he gets into the battle, and anybody who aligned themselves with David and was an Israelite was victorious that day. Not because they went and killed Goliath, but because they were on the same team as the one who did. And when David killed Goliath, then the Israelites were emboldened, and then they started defeating the Philistines as well, the remainders. The nation of Israel, in a sense, was justified or made right against the Philistines because David's faithfulness carried the day. Jesus was the forger of a path for us. And had he never done that, we couldn't be justified. That's part of this. Now, notice another part. Is that in verse 24, Jesus is the redemption for us. He made the purchase with his own blood. We'll say more about that in just a moment. So that he could be both the just and the justifier. He paid the price. In the Bible, there are two masters that you can have. You can either have Satan and sin as your master, or you can have Jesus. Do you remember in the book of Exodus when all the firstborn died, and that finally made Pharaoh say, go ahead and leave? And that the picture there is like there was a redemption price that was made so that these people could be released from their master. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. Jesus paid the price. If you look at historical writings going back to like 300 AD, there's people that debate, okay, well, if Jesus paid the ransom price, that demands somebody was paid. So did God pay Satan? Was the Father paid by Jesus' sacrifice? And I just want to point out, people have different theories about all of that, but do you see that the text doesn't just come out and answer that? It expects to put this in front of us and go, if you're wondering how a just God can still forgive people, part of this is that Jesus was faithful to everything, so faithful that he became the redemption cost with his own blood, and the price was paid. The account has been settled. And the question of, well, who was paid? Was it Satan or this or that? That's not really the question. We're supposed to believe this by faith, that this, in God's mind, settles it. He paid the price. And for that, we ought to rejoice and be thankful. Now, we could say more about that, but we don't have time. I want to go ahead and get to the next word that's used in this passage that brings up even a little bit more debate, is propitiation. Again, we're asking the question, how can a just God justify people who are sinners? And we've seen that it's through the faithfulness of Jesus to have lived everything out and be the representative human being for us. It's through the redemption price that he paid, but it's also this propitiation. This is not a word that we use often. The Greek word here is hilasterion. And let me just point out a couple things about this, and if I can just gently challenge us maybe to think in a little different way about some of this. The way that the Greeks would use this word hilasterion would be, we have to worship Zeus and Poseidon, and we're going to bring these offerings to Zeus and Poseidon so that those gods aren't angry at us and venting their wrath towards us. That's the way that you can find the Greeks using this kind of term. And so a lot of people have suggested that in passages like this, when Paul uses the word hilasterion, the picture is that God is just angry and he needs to vent his wrath. And Jesus is the one that he vented his wrath on. So Jesus was separated from the Father on the cross. Jesus even descended into hell because God poured all of his wrath on Jesus. And let me just suggest to you, that's not the picture in this passage. The picture in this passage is not God zapping people constantly and something needs to absorb his wrath. Instead, the picture in this passage is that God has been gracious. He's been overlooking sin. He's a gracious God, and rather than finding a place to vent his wrath, there needs to be justification that he's been so gracious. That's the picture here. And so if we shift away from the Greek way of using this word to the more Jewish way of using this word, look where else this same word for propitiation is used in the New Testament. Hebrews 9:5. Above it, talking about the mercy seat and the Ark of the Covenant, above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Now the word mercy seat is the same word hilasterion, same word for propitiation. So the word propitiation means mercy seat, which invokes all kinds of not Greek images of this word, but how the Jews would have considered this image. And I understand that some of this is intellectually complicated, and I guess I don't apologize for that, actually. This is what the Bible is teaching. And we got to do the homework and try to work through some of this. What was the mercy seat in the Old Testament? It was the place in the most holy place where the high priest would go with blood and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. Have you ever thought, which would atone for the people's sin for the year? We'll say more about that in just a second. But have you ever thought in the Old Testament, the very throne of God is called a mercy seat? Has that struck you? Where God dwells in the Old Testament even is called the mercy seat. What kind of God do we have? And they would once a year go and sprinkle blood on this mercy seat to atone. It doesn't say to assuage his wrath. That's not the picture here. The picture here is to cleanse from sin. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 16 says, "Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel and because of their transgressions, all their sins. And so he will do for the tent of meeting which dwells with them in the midst of their uncleanness." It emphasizes the uncleanness of the people, and this sacrifice is removing the uncleanness. It's taking it away. By what mechanism? I don't know how to answer all of that, but in God's mind, this is what is due. This is what justifies his justification of us. There's a sacrifice that's been made that purges us of our impurities. And by the way, this is the same way that other passages in the New Testament bring up this same picture. In Hebrews 9, 13, and 14, "For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify," not assuage the wrath of the Father, "purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God." What is it that the sacrifices in the Old Testament did? In God's logic, they purified. They purged people of uncleanness. And what it's doing for us now is it's purifying our conscience. Can you explain all of the mechanism of that? I can't. But in God's economy, in the way that God looks at sin, this is what purges and cleanses, like some kind of ritual soap or something that just purges all the sin out of the way. That's the language that the Bible gives of this. How can God be the just and the justifier? Jesus came and he did what we couldn't do. Jesus became the price to settle the account. And Jesus became the propitiation, the atoning sacrifice that removes the sin from us. Now, there's been 2,000 years of people writing books about this, of good thinkers even debating how some of this all works. But the point in this passage is God is completely just for forgiving us. He's not an unrighteous judge who's just waving his hand. There's been a price that's been paid. There's been a sacrifice that's been made. There's been somebody that's lived out perfectly. And in God's estimation of things, that makes him just. What are the results of this in this passage? The results of this in this passage is, first of all, that there's no more boasting. If you really understand the gospel, and there's going to be depths of the atonement and how all of that works that we may never fully understand, but if you understand what this passage is saying, you will stop boasting. And this applies to the Jews who boasted in the law, and they boasted in circumcision. And this would also apply to Gentiles. And this is not just, are you good at baseball? Yeah, I can throw pretty good. Are you good shooting a gun? Yeah, I can do that. That's not the kind of boasting we're talking about. We're talking about you thinking that you're something before God because of some advantage that you think you have in life. Before God, we're nothing. But because of what Jesus has done, we've been exalted to have everything. Do you realize that for a real Christian, we ought to be the most humble people on earth? We've been doubly humbled. First of all, by the law that showed us our sin. Showing us that this resume that we've been building, all the ways that we try to impress people and get compliments from people, that before God, he could just look at that and say, that doesn't justify you. I don't care how many people think you're great. And then the law comes and says, you're not what you think you are. Humbled. But we've been doubly humbled because the way we've been saved is not because of our works. We've not been justified because we lived everything out perfectly. We've been justified because Jesus had to come and redeem us. He's the one who had to pay the price because we never could. So we're humbled by the law in our condemnation, and we're also humbled by our exaltation, which means that the gospel is going to create people that nothing else can create. People who are genuinely humble but confident at the same time. Ask yourself if you're straddling a horse right now, where sometimes you fall on this side of despair and I'm terrible, and then sometimes you fall on the other side where you embarrass yourself because of how great you think you are, and then you're humbled because of circumstances. The gospel creates people that can say, I'm not perfect before God, but God has done everything for me to lift me up. I will not boast in myself. Is that your heart? If you really understand, and if I really understand the gospel, I will stop thinking that I have earned anything before God. There's one other thing, though. One of the results of this is that God has created in himself a new people. If you look at verses 29 and 30. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Yes, the Gentiles also, since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. I think one of the reasons that Paul wrote this book was to create unity at the church in Rome. That there were some people that grew up Jewish, and that they thought that that meant that they had an advantage over the Gentiles. And Paul's been leveling everybody at the cross. You guys are all saved the same way. Gentiles don't have to become Jews first. You guys are all saved by faith in Jesus Christ. He's going to bring up in Romans chapter 6, when you were baptized into Jesus, that's when you drew a line in the sand. You look around this room. We've got people of different skin color. We've got people of different political persuasions. We've got people of different educational backgrounds. We've got people of different socioeconomic statuses. And all of us in this room who are right with Jesus have been saved the same way. And so he's created one new man in himself, and it's one group of people that understand that they have no reason to boast in themselves, but every reason to boast in Jesus. I'll tell you that I think the church in Rome, if they really understood what Paul was writing here, it would have created a more cohesive church. That wouldn't have looked at some people who went to a certain college, like Florida College, and other ones who didn't, and some who grew up in Christian families, and others who didn't grow up in Christian families, and some who have tattoos, and others who don't have tattoos, and some who have more checkered backgrounds than others, that they would understand in Christ, we're all part of the same family. And the earthly differences, the more spiritually minded I am, just dissolve. And Jesus has saved every one of us the same way, by faith. Are you somebody who's living by faith? When he says something, do you say, okay, God, I'm not the one in control of my life? We'll show again next week, or Lord willing in the coming weeks, that this obviously doesn't mean we're going to do it perfectly, but we never use that as an excuse to do something we ought not do. We're going to sing this song, All Things Are Ready. Jesus has done everything that's needed for us to receive salvation. And we respond to that by repenting and being baptized. And receiving a gift doesn't give us cause to boast. Receiving a gift means I understand that I'm in need, and it makes sense to take the thing that I need. Is there anybody here tonight that's been building their own resume in their own mind and before others, hoping that it's going to be enough for God? Or do you need to shift your mind and realize that it's through faith in Jesus that you're justified? Do you want the gavel to be pounded and for you to be able to stand before God on final judgment day, even though you lived an ungodly life at times? Do you want that gavel to be pounded and for him to say, well done, good and faithful servant? It's going to happen if you have faith. If you have loyalty to God, not just getting check marks. We'll continue looking at some of those ideas as we get into Romans chapter 4. I thank you for your good attention tonight. I know that the text that we looked at has some difficulties to work through. But Paul wrote this, and we need this. God inspired him to write these things, and we need everything in the Bible. All things are ready. If there's anybody here that has any needs tonight, please come forward while we stand and while we sing.